3 years ago, I took out a second mortgage to save our family home from foreclosure. $250,000 borrowed against my future because I believed that family meant something more than a shared last name. I worked 3 jobs to make those payments, cleaning offices at 5 a.m., waiting tables through lunch rushes that left my feet screaming, stocking shelves until midnight while other people slept in beds I was paying for them to keep. My hands bled from industrial cleaning chemicals. My back ached from lifting boxes that weighed more than my hope some days. But I did it, every payment, on time, for 36 months straight. I saved the house where my mother raised us, where my sister's children played in the backyard, where 3 generations of family memories lived in walls I'd nearly killed myself to protect. Yesterday, I drove up the driveway I'd been too broke to repave but too proud to abandon, and found a note taped to the front door. My sister's handwriting, casual as a grocery list. Penelope, we sold the house to developers. Closing was this morning. Thanks for everything, Lisa and Mom. $250,000 of my blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. Gone. Sold while I was at work, earning money to pay for a home I no longer owned. They thought I was too exhausted to fight back. They were wrong. 3 years ago, I took out a second mortgage to save our family home from foreclosure. $250,000 borrowed against my future because I believed that family meant something more than a shared last name. I worked 3 jobs to make those payments, cleaning offices at 5 a.m., waiting tables through lunch rushes that left my feet screaming, stocking shelves until midnight while other people slept in beds I was paying for them to keep. My hands bled from industrial cleaning chemicals. My back ached from lifting boxes that weighed more than my hope some days. But I did it, every payment, on time, for 36 months straight. I saved the house where my mother raised us, where my sister's children played in the backyard, where 3 generations of family memories lived in walls I'd nearly killed myself to protect. Yesterday, I drove up the driveway I'd been too broke to repave but too proud to abandon, and found a note taped to the front door. My sister's handwriting, casual as a grocery list. Penelope, we sold the house to developers. Closing was this morning. Thanks for everything, Lisa and Mom. $250,000 of my blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. Gone. Sold while I was at work, earning money to pay for a home I no longer owned. They thought I was too exhausted to fight back. They were wrong. My name is Penelope Martin, 35 years old. In my family, I wasn't just a daughter. I was the safety net, the bailout, the human ATM they turned to every time their mistakes came due for collection. Growing up in our 3-bedroom ranch in Millfield, Ohio, I learned early that love in the Martin household came with terms and conditions. While my younger brother Darren got participation trophies and college funds, I got lectures about responsibility and the privilege of being trusted with adult problems at age 12. When Dad's gambling debts piled up like autumn leaves, I was the one washing dishes at Rosetti's Italian kitchen after school. My homework spread across sticky tabletops while I counted crumpled tips in the glow of fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly and desperate. Every dollar went home, every cent earned through burns from commercial dishwashers and the kind of exhaustion that settles in your bones like concrete. The house on Maple Street became our family's anchor after we lost the first one to bankruptcy when I was 16. Dad had borrowed against his pension to buy it, a modest colonial with blue shutters, and a mortgage payment that consumed 60% of his disability check. It should have been impossible to afford, but somehow we managed, which is to say, I managed, working double shifts at 3 different jobs while Darren played varsity basketball and dated cheerleaders. One day, you'll thank us for this house, Dad would tell me, bourbon thick on his breath as he stood in the kitchen I'd scrubbed clean after my shift at the diner. It's the family's legacy, something that'll belong to all of us someday. I did thank him. Every month when I handed over $800 to cover the mortgage shortfall. Every Christmas when I worked through the holidays so they could buy Darren the gaming system he'd been wanting. Every birthday when my present to myself was the knowledge that we'd made another payment on time. The family portrait was picture perfect from the outside. Mom polishing crystal bowls for dinner parties that never happened, arranging silk flowers in vases that gathered dust while she waited for occasions worthy of her best dishes. Dad holding court at Millfield Community Center, bragging to anyone who'd listen that his daughter was responsible, reliable, the kind of girl who understood what family meant. Meanwhile, Darren breezed through a series of part-time jobs and full-time girlfriends, Quitting when managers expected too much, getting fired when showing up became inconvenient, always cushioned by the financial security I'd bled myself dry to create. His mistakes had soft landings because I'd built the safety net. His dreams had funding because I'd sacrificed mine. By the time the 2019 property tax assessment nearly doubled our annual payments, I was already working 3 jobs. Morning shifts, cleaning office buildings, afternoons waiting tables at the diner, nights stocking shelves at Target. My hands were permanently stained with industrial cleaner, my feet swollen from 16-hour days, my bank account emptied as fast as I could fill it. That's when Mom sat me down at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills spread like tarot cards predicting our financial future, and explained that we needed to take out a second mortgage to avoid foreclosure. The monthly payments would be crushing, she said, but it was the only way to save the house Dad called our legacy. We can't qualify on our own, she admitted, her voice carrying the shame that comes with asking your child to mortgage their future for your mistakes. But your credit is perfect. Your income is steady. The bank would approve you in a heartbeat. I signed those papers sitting in a loan officer's sterile office, my hand cramping as I put my name on documents that would chain me to that house for the next 30 years. $250,000 borrowed against my future, with payments that would consume every spare dollar I'd ever earn. But I did it. Because the house wasn't just wood and nails to me. It was my penance for being born into a family that needed more than they could provide. It was my prison, built from guilt and obligation and the desperate hope that maybe, if I carried enough weight, they'd finally see me as more than their emergency fund. It was my proof that love could be measured in mortgage payments, that sacrifice could be quantified in sleepless nights, that maybe if I just gave enough, worked enough, bled enough, they'd love me back the way I'd always loved them, unconditionally, desperately, completely. The house became my religion, and I was its most devoted worshiper, offering up every dollar, every hour, every piece of myself on the altar of family loyalty. 3 years. The calendar on my kitchen wall marked the passage of time in mortgage payments instead of milestones. 36 months of saying no to myself so I could say yes to keeping our family home. The routine became my religion, and exhaustion became my prayer. Monday through Friday, 4:30 a.m. alarm for the office cleaning contract downtown. Scrubbing bathrooms in corporate buildings while executives slept in beds they could afford to keep. 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. waiting tables at Rossetti's, balancing plates and fake smiles while my feet screamed inside shoes held together with duct tape and determination. 8 p.m. to midnight stocking shelves at Target, unloading boxes that felt heavier with each passing month. Weekends meant overtime shifts and side gigs, catering weddings I'd never be able to afford, cleaning houses in neighborhoods where the monthly property taxes exceeded my annual income. Every dollar earned carried a destination written in my own handwriting across accounting spreadsheets. Mortgage payment due. My coffee went cold on those spreadsheets every night, the numbers blurring as I calculated and recalculated whether we'd make it another month. The math was always the same, brutal but manageable, as long as I never got sick, never took a day off, never allowed myself the luxury of being human instead of a human ATM. 3 birthdays passed without celebration because overtime shifts mattered more than cake. 3 Christmases where my gift to myself was the knowledge that January's payment was already covered. 3 summers where I watched other people plan vacations while I planned payment schedules that stretched my income thinner than tissue paper. My hands told the story of those years in scars and stains. Raw from balancing restaurant trays loaded with food I couldn't afford to eat. Ink stained from signing checks that emptied my account as fast as I could fill it. Calloused from lifting boxes at Target, each one a small sacrifice toward the larger altar of family loyalty. The social cost was invisible but devastating. Friends stopped calling when I declined every invitation, every dinner, every movie night that cost more than $1 menu meal. Dating became impossible when every spare hour was spent working and every spare dollar went to mortgage payments. My life narrowed to a single purpose: keeping that house, keeping my family secure, keeping my promise to be the safety net they'd learned to depend on. But every dollar saved felt like a brick in the wall of security I was building. Every payment made on time was proof that sacrifice could be transformed into stability, that maybe if I worked hard enough, long enough, desperately enough, I could earn something more than their gratitude, their respect, their recognition, their acknowledgement that I'd given everything to protect what they called our legacy. Mom would show me the thank you cards she wrote but never sent, her gratitude measured in words she was too proud to speak out loud. Dad would nod approvingly when neighbors commented on how well the house looked, never mentioning that the maintenance came from my overtime wages, the repairs from my sleepless nights. Darren benefited most from the security I'd bled to create. While I worked 3 jobs, he worked through a series of girlfriends and get-rich-quick schemes that never quite materialized into actual income. His job at the auto parts store was more social club than employment, showing up when convenient, calling in sick when parties beckoned, always confident that his mistakes would be cushioned by the financial foundation I'd laid with my own exhaustion. The warning came during Thanksgiving dinner in year 2, a casual whisper I caught between Darren and Dad while I was washing dishes they'd dirtied but would never clean. "Once the house is totally secure," Darren said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of someone who'd never worried about mortgage payments, "we could flip it for some serious cash. Property values in this neighborhood have gone through the roof." Dad's response was a grunt that could have meant anything, but the tone suggested interest rather than outrage. They were discussing the house I was killing myself to save as if it were an investment property, a commodity to be leveraged rather than a home to be preserved. I laughed it off that night, standing at the sink with dish soap up to my elbows and exhaustion weighing down my shoulders like a lead blanket. Darren was always full of schemes that went nowhere, plans that evaporated as soon as they required actual effort. The house was our family legacy, Dad's words echoing in my memory. It belonged to all of us, would shelter us all, would stand as proof that sacrifice could build something lasting. How foolish I was to believe that belonging meant the same thing to all of us. The 3rd year was the hardest. The initial adrenaline of saving the house had worn off, replaced by a grinding routine that felt like slow-motion drowning. My body was failing in small ways, chronic back pain from lifting boxes, migraines from fluorescent lights, a cough that wouldn't clear because I couldn't afford to take time off to recover properly. But I kept going because the alternative was unthinkable. Losing the house would mean losing the only thing that made my sacrifice meaningful, the only proof that my 3 years of bleeding had purchased something worth keeping. Every payment was a victory lap around doubt. Every month we stayed current on the mortgage was evidence that impossible things could become inevitable if you were willing to pay the price in your own flesh and sanity. What I didn't understand was that I was the only one paying that price. What I couldn't see was that while I was working myself to death to build our security, they were planning to cash it in for their convenience. The house that had become my purpose was always destined to become their profit. October 15th, a Tuesday morning that started like any other in a life that had been reduced to survival routines and mortgage calculations. I'd finished my overnight shift at Target, stocking Halloween decorations that other families would buy to celebrate holidays. I'd been too exhausted to acknowledge for 3 years. The drive home took me past the elementary school where I'd once imagined my future children would learn to read, past the coffee shop where I'd stopped treating myself to $5 lattes because every dollar had a more important destination written in my cramped handwriting across budget spreadsheets. Maple Street looked exactly as it had for 36 months, tree-lined and quiet, the kind of suburban normalcy that costs more than it appears to be worth. Our house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac like a blue-shuttered promise, its modest colonial lines familiar as my own heartbeat, the mortgage payments as regular as breathing. I pulled into the driveway I'd been too broke to repave, gravel crunching under tires that needed replacing, but would have to wait another month because the house payment came first. Always first, forever first. Grocery bags filled my arms, generic brands and day-old bread, the kind of careful shopping that comes when every purchase is weighed against mortgage obligations. That's when I saw it. A piece of paper taped to the front door, fluttering in autumn wind like a surrender flag against wood. I'd painted myself 2 summers earlier with paint I'd bought on clearance and primer that had cost me a week of lunch money. I set the grocery bags on the porch steps, my hands already shaking with something that felt like recognition before my brain had processed what I was seeing. The handwriting was Mom's careful cursive learned in Catholic school 70 years earlier, the same script that had signed birthday cards and grocery lists, and all the mundane correspondence of a life lived in the margins of other people's drama. "Penelope," it began, as casual as a weather report, "we sold the house to the Johnsons next door. Closing was yesterday. You'll understand someday. Thanks for everything. Love, Mom and Lisa." The words swam on the page like they were drowning, each letter a tiny knife cutting through 3 years of sacrifice that had just been declared meaningless with the stroke of a pen I'd never been asked to hold. My knees buckled before my mind did, the physical impact hitting faster than comprehension. I sat hard on the porch steps, grocery bags spilling around me like offerings to a god who'd just revealed himself to be a con artist. Milk cartons rolled across concrete that had cracked over 3 winters I'd been too poor to repair but too invested to abandon. 3 years of my life, reduced to thanks for everything, as if I'd brought them casseroles during a minor illness instead of mortgaging my entire future to save their house from foreclosure. The key still worked, a small mercy in a universe that had apparently decided I no longer deserved larger ones. I pushed open the front door to find rooms stripped bare as picked bones. Curtains gone from windows I'd cleaned every Saturday. Furniture vanished like it had never existed. Even the kitchen table where I'd spread mortgage statements and budget calculations had been erased, leaving behind only the ghost impressions of chair legs on hardwood floors I'd refinished with my own hands. They hadn't just sold the house. They'd gutted it of everything that made it home, packed up their lives like they were fleeing a crime scene, leaving behind nothing but empty rooms and the echo of my own breathing in spaces that had once held family dinners and Christmas mornings and all the ordinary moments that justify extraordinary sacrifice. I walked through the house like a ghost touring the scene of her own death, my footsteps hollow in rooms that had swallowed 3 years of my life and now refused to acknowledge I'd ever existed within their walls. The living room where I'd collapsed after 18-hour workdays, too tired to climb the stairs to my bedroom, empty. The kitchen where I'd calculated mortgage payments by the light of my phone because we'd had the electricity turned off twice when I couldn't cover both utilities and the house payment in the same month. Stripped clean. My bedroom, where I'd lain awake nights wondering if the sacrifice was worth it, if killing myself to save their house would ever earn me the love and respect I'd been chasing since childhood. Vacant as a tomb. But it was the basement that broke me. The concrete walls where I'd stored Christmas decorations for holidays I'd been too exhausted to celebrate, where boxes of my childhood memories had sat gathering dust, while I worked myself to death to pay for the privilege of keeping them safe. All gone. Every photo, every memento, every piece of evidence that I'd ever lived in this house I'd nearly died to save. They'd erased me as thoroughly as if I'd never existed, packed up my entire life and taken it with them to whatever new address they'd failed to share. I stood in that empty basement and screamed until my throat was raw, until my voice cracked and failed and all that remained was the sound of my own rage echoing off walls that would never again shelter the family I'd sacrificed everything to protect. Understand someday? I shouted at concrete that absorbed my fury without reflection. You sold my life's work, my future, my dignity, behind my back like I was some stranger instead of the daughter who saved your house when you were too broke and too proud to save it yourselves. The echo that came back sounded like mockery, like the house itself was laughing at the woman who'd loved it enough to destroy herself for it, who'd worked 3 jobs and sacrificed 3 years and borrowed against 30 years of future payments to keep it from being sold to strangers. Except now it had been sold to strangers anyway. The Johnsons next door, who'd probably been watching for months as I painted shutters and replaced broken windows and made repairs with money I'd earned scrubbing other people's toilets and serving other people's food and stocking other people's shelves. Standing in that empty house, surrounded by the absence of everything I'd worked to preserve, I finally understood what I'd been to them all along. Not their daughter, not their family. Not even their partner in preserving what Dad had called our legacy. I'd been their loan officer, their private mortgage company, their personal ATM, available for withdrawal whenever they needed access to funds they didn't have and credit they couldn't qualify for. And now that the house was paid off, now that the crisis had passed and the property had appreciated enough to generate serious profit, they'd cashed out and moved on without bothering to inform the woman whose blood and sweat had made their windfall possible. The grocery bags I'd left on the front porch were still there when I walked out of that empty house for the last time, milk spoiling in October sunshine, bread growing stale in air that tasted like betrayal, food I'd bought to stock a kitchen that was no longer mine, in a house I no longer owned, paid for with money I'd earned to support a family that had just proven they'd never considered me part of their equation. I got in my car and drove away from Maple Street without looking back, but I could feel the house watching me in my rearview mirror, its blue shutters glowing like accusations in afternoon light that suddenly seemed too bright for the darkness that had settled in my chest. They thought I was too exhausted to fight back, too beaten down by 3 years of sacrifice to do anything but accept their casual cruelty and move on with whatever remained of my demolished life. I found them at Mom's new apartment in Riverside Heights, a luxury complex with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that cost more per month than I'd ever made in two. The address had taken 3 phone calls and a reverse lookup service to track down, because apparently relocating without informing the daughter who'd financed their lives was just another Tuesday for the Martin family. They were celebrating. I could hear laughter through the door before I knocked, the kind of relaxed, genuine joy that comes when all your problems have been solved by someone else's sacrifice, and you're free to enjoy the profits without acknowledging the cost. Mom answered wearing a dress I'd never seen, her hair professionally styled in a way that suggested salon appointments had replaced the kitchen table cuts she'd been giving herself for 20 years. Behind her, I could see Darren lounging on a leather sectional that probably cost more than my car, sipping champagne from crystal flutes that caught afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. "Penelope," Mom's voice carried the forced brightness of someone caught in an act they knew was wrong but refused to admit it. "What a surprise! We were just about to call you." "Were you?" I stepped into their new living room without being invited, taking in the space that my $250,000 had purchased. "Because I've been trying to reach you since yesterday. Since I found the note taped to the door of the house I spent 3 years killing myself to save." Darren looked up from his champagne, his face wearing the smug satisfaction of someone who'd just won a lottery he'd never bothered to buy a ticket for. "Hey sis, we figured you'd be relieved. No more mortgage payments, no more stress, you're free now." Relieved. The word hit me like a slap across a face that was already raw from 24 hours of trying to process the magnitude of their betrayal. I was supposed to be relieved that my $250,000 sacrifice had become his down payment on a lifestyle upgrade he'd never worked a day to earn. Relieved? My voice came out quieter than I'd intended, but it carried the kind of controlled fury that makes smart people step backward. "You sold the house I saved, took the profits I earned, and moved into luxury apartments I'll never be able to afford. And you thought I'd be relieved?" Dad emerged from the kitchen carrying his own champagne flute, his face already flushed with alcohol and the kind of entitlement that comes from a lifetime of other people cleaning up his mistakes. He looked at me the way you'd look at a child throwing a tantrum over something they're too young to understand. "Penelope, sit down. Let me explain how the real world works." He settled into a recliner that probably cost more than I made in a month, leaning back with the casual confidence of a man who'd never doubted his right to spend other people's money. "Family members sacrifice for each other. That's what family means. You'll get over it. Family sacrifices." The phrase echoed in the apartment that my sacrifice had purchased, surrounded by furniture my sacrifice had paid for, looking at people whose comfort my sacrifice had secured. That's when it crystallized. The realization that should have been obvious years earlier but had been hidden behind love and loyalty, and the desperate hope that maybe, if I gave enough, they'd finally see me as more than their emergency fund. I was the only one who ever sacrificed. I was the only one who'd given up anything, worked multiple jobs, gone without sleep or food or the basic human pleasures that make life worth living. They'd never sacrificed anything except their daughter's future, and they'd done it so casually they thought I should be grateful for the experience. "You're right," I said, my voice steady in a way that made all 3 of them look at me more carefully. "Family members do sacrifice for each other. So when do I get to see your sacrifices? When do I get to benefit from your sleepless nights and bleeding hands and 40-hour weekends?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier celebration. This was the silence of people realizing they'd been caught in a lie so fundamental they'd forgotten they were telling it. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through 3 years of bank statements that told the story they were trying to rewrite. July 2019, $2,847 mortgage payment from my checking account. August 2019, $2,847 from my checking account. Every month, for 36 months straight. My money, my sacrifice, my 3 years of killing myself to save a house you just sold for profit. The bank statements glowed on my phone screen like evidence in a trial where I was finally ready to be both prosecutor and judge. Every payment documented, every sacrifice recorded, every month of my life reduced to numbers that proved exactly how one-sided our family's version of mutual sacrifice had always been. Mom set down her champagne flute, her face wearing the expression of someone who'd been enjoying a party until someone mentioned that the house was on fire. "Sweetheart, you're being dramatic. We never asked you to make those payments. You volunteered." I volunteered because you told me you'd lose the house without help. I volunteered because I believed family meant something more than a convenient source of funding. I volunteered because I was stupid enough to think that saving your home would make me part of your family instead of just your ATM. I looked around their new apartment, at the life they'd built with money. I'd earned scrubbing toilets and serving food and stocking shelves until my hands bled, and my feet swelled, and my back ached with the weight of carrying people who'd never offered to carry me. But mostly, I continued, my voice getting stronger with each word, I volunteered because I didn't understand that I was the only one making sacrifices in a family where everyone else just made excuses. Darren set down his champagne, his smug expression finally cracking as he realized this wasn't going to be the easy conversation they'd planned. Look, Penn, we're grateful for what you did. But the house was in Mom and Dad's names. Legally, they had every right to sell it. Legally, yes. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, but not before screenshotting the bank statements that would become evidence in conversations they didn't know were coming. Morally, ethically, humanly, that's a different story altogether. I walked to their floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at a view they'd never have afforded without my 3 years of sacrifice, and felt something shift in my chest, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves before an earthquake. For 35 years, I'd been the family's designated victim, the one who absorbed their failures, solved their problems, paid for their mistakes, without complaint or recognition. I'd been trained from childhood to accept crumbs and call them banquets, to be grateful for the privilege of being used by people who mistook my love for weakness. But weakness doesn't work 3 jobs for 3 years. Weakness doesn't sacrifice $250,000 to save someone else's house. Weakness doesn't survive the kind of betrayal that would break most people's faith in family forever. What they'd mistaken for weakness was actually strength that had been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up and show them exactly what survival looks like when it stops being polite and starts being honest. I turned away from their luxury view and faced the 3 people who'd just taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Blood doesn't make family, and family doesn't guarantee loyalty. And sometimes the people you love most are the ones you need to love yourself enough to walk away from. You're right about one thing, I said, my voice carrying the kind of calm that precedes storms. I will get over it. But first, I'm going to make sure you never forget it. I walked out of their apartment the same way I'd walked out of the house they'd sold behind my back, without looking backward, but with the absolute certainty that they'd underestimated the woman they thought they'd defeated. 6 months after they sold my life's work, I signed papers for a condo in downtown Toledo, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, 900 square feet of space that belonged to me and only me. The down payment came from the emergency fund I'd been secretly building since the day I'd found that note on the door. Money earned through the same 3-job routine that had once funded their security, but now purchased my freedom. Every dollar saved was an act of defiance, every payment made toward my own future instead of their past. The mortgage was mine. The deed carried my name alone. The keys fit locks that no one else could change, open doors that no one else could close, secure windows that reflected only my face back at me. For the first time in 35 years, I was building something they couldn't take away. The walls were painted sage green, a color I'd chosen not because anyone else liked it, but because it made me feel calm in a way I'd never experienced in spaces where other people's needs determined every decoration, every decision, every dollar spent on making a house feel like home. I furnished it slowly, carefully, with pieces bought using overtime wages that no longer disappeared into someone else's mortgage payments, a kitchen table where I could eat meals without criticism, a couch where I could collapse after work without feeling guilty about taking up space. Bookshelves filled with stories about women who'd survived worse betrayals and emerged stronger. The legal documentation arrived in official envelopes throughout that first year, each one a small victory in the war I was waging against people who'd mistaken my silence for surrender. Copies of mortgage payments I'd made, bank records showing exactly where my $250,000 had gone, phone records of the calls they'd never returned after stealing my savings. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Carmen Rodriguez who specialized in financial exploitation cases, had taken one look at my documentation and smiled the kind of smile that meant someone was about to learn an expensive lesson about the difference between legal and ethical. They thought they were clever, she told me over coffee in her downtown office, surrounded by case files of other people who'd been robbed by relatives who'd confused love with license to steal. But theft is theft, regardless of shared DNA, and we have enough evidence to prove they knew exactly what they were taking. The lawsuit wasn't about revenge, it was about recognition. Recognition that my contribution had been more than a gift, that my sacrifice had purchased equity they'd stolen, that their casual dismissal of my pain didn't erase the mathematical reality of what I'd given and what they'd taken. But more than any legal victory, it was the apartment itself that healed me. Waking up in a space where my presence was wanted instead of tolerated. Cooking meals in a kitchen where every utensil had been chosen by me, for me. Sitting on a balcony that overlooked a city where I'd built a new life from the ashes of their betrayal. I wasn't their fixer anymore. Wasn't their ATM, their safety net, their convenient solution to problems they'd created but couldn't solve. I was the woman who'd walked through the fire of their rejection and used the heat to forge something they could never touch, a sense of self-worth that didn't depend on their approval. The house they'd sold had been brick and wood, mortgage payments and repair bills, a structure that could be bought and sold and stolen by people who understood the price of everything and the value of nothing. But the home I'd rebuilt was spine and soul, strength and determination, the kind of foundation that gets stronger under pressure instead of crumbling beneath it. Some evenings, I'd stand at my living room window watching Toledo spread out below me like a map of possibilities, my reflection clear in glass that no one else had ever touched. The city lights reminded me that I was part of something larger than one family's dysfunction, connected to millions of other people who'd learned to build their own security, instead of depending on others to provide it. The old house still existed, of course, 30 minutes away on Maple Street, now owned by the Johnson family, who'd probably gotten a good deal on a property that came with invisible bloodstains and a history of sacrifice they'd never know about. Sometimes I'd drive past it, not from nostalgia, but from curiosity, wondering if new owners could sense the ghost of all that work, all that hope, all that misplaced faith in people who'd never deserved it. But the house was just wood and brick now, emptied of the meaning I'd once poured into its walls. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had become my blueprint for something better, not a structure that others could steal, but a life that belonged entirely to me. My phone still carried their numbers, though they'd stopped calling after the legal papers arrived. Occasionally, I'd get secondhand updates through mutual acquaintances. Dad's gambling debts had returned, Mom's new apartment was more expensive than she could afford. Darren's get-rich-quick schemes were failing with their usual predictability. Their problems were no longer mine to solve. Their crises no longer required my sacrifice. Their mistakes no longer demanded my money, my time, my sleepless nights spent calculating how to save people who'd never learned to save themselves. Standing in my apartment on a Tuesday evening in December, watching snow fall past windows I'd hung with curtains I'd chosen, I realized something that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. I was grateful for their betrayal. Not grateful for the pain, the shock, the crushing realization that the people I'd loved most had valued me least. But grateful for the freedom that came after. The liberation of loving people who loved me back, of working for goals that were mine to achieve, of building a life that reflected my choices instead of their needs. They'd thought selling the house would break me, reduce me to the grateful victim who'd accept crumbs and call them celebration. Instead, it had freed me from the prison of believing that family loyalty meant one-sided sacrifice, that love required self-destruction, that my worth was measured by my willingness to be used. The house could be stolen, but the home I'd built inside myself, the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive their betrayal, smart enough to rebuild from nothing, brave enough to choose myself over people who'd never chosen me, that could never be taken. It was mine. Finally, completely, unshakably mine. And no note on any door would ever change that again. If Penelope's story made your chest tight with recognition, if you've ever sacrificed everything for people who took it for granted, if you've ever been the family ATM that everyone makes withdrawals from but no one makes deposits to, you understand why this story had to be told. This isn't just about stolen houses or financial betrayal. It's about learning that being the family fixer doesn't make you family, it makes you convenient. It's about understanding that people who truly love you don't build their security on your sacrifice. Hit that like button if you've ever had to choose between being used and being free. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week, we're sharing another story about someone who discovered that walking away from toxic family can be the most loving thing you do for yourself. Share this with someone who needs to remember that family loyalty should flow both ways. Comment below and tell me about a moment when you realized that being strong didn't mean carrying other people's weight, because those stories remind all of us that sometimes the most radical act is refusing to be someone else's safety net. Remember, you don't owe anyone your financial future just because they share your DNA. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. And you definitely don't need permission from people who exploit you to stop letting them exploit you. Penelope worked 3 jobs to save their house. But the home she built for herself, that was worth more than any mortgage payment.